In this lecture, I'm going to show you how you can remove the Blender grid. Sometimes if you're working with a very big object, the Blender grid might get in the way in the same way that the 3D gizmo could also get in your way when you're editing larger objects. So let's have a look at how we can get rid of the Blender grid. Not delete it as such, just make it invisible, like we would make an object invisible. So we're going to go into Blender, and to keep this lecture nice and short, I've kept it very advanced. So what you're seeing right now is a scaled up version of Suzanne the monkey that has been UV mapped, but I want to be able to look at my monkey without the Blender grid getting in the way. So several ways I could do that. I could just simply drag it up, but then I'd need to change my navigation, or I could simply get rid of the Blender grid. To do that, all I have to do is open up the scene properties, which is this panel here. So you can do that by pressing the N key. And if you start at the top and you scroll down to where it says display, you may need to click to bring it up. You'll have a series of options. These allow you to display certain things. So for example, the world background, we can see the shadings just turned slightly there. We can see outline selection, relationship lines, but the one we're interested in is grid floor. Now this one is interesting as well because we have different options such as lines, scale and subdivisions. If we press the Z axis, nothing appears to have happened. If we press the Y again, nothing appears to have happened, or has it? Something has happened. If we zoom in, we've still got our x-axis line, but we no longer have our y-axis line, which should be coming out of here. If we click on the Y, we can see it now coming out. If we click on a Z, we can't see anything, but that's because our grid is still in 2 dimensions. We can actually increase the number of lines in our Blender grid. So if I increase that to 32, our Blender grid becomes much larger. So we can increase and decrease the size of the Blender grid, a very handy tool. Let's try 64. And as we can see, much bigger. And this is actually starting to look a lot more like it would in Unity. In Unity, our grid system, which looks quite similar to this, but is actually very large. It starts on a very large scale, whereas Blender's grid starts very small. And we can continue to increase that. So if we try 128, even bigger still, and so on and so on. We can increase the scale as well. This is the distance between the grid lines. So by increasing this value, we're increasing the sizing of all of the little cubes. This, as a result, is another way of increasing the size of the Blender grid. But what we want to do now is make it invisible. All we have to do is untick this box. And there we go, the Blender grid is now completely invisible. The axis lines are still visible, and if you want to turn those off, you simply click on X and Y. If I click on the gizmo tool at the bottom here, we've gotten rid of that as well. So now all we have in our scene are our objects. But of course, if we need to, we can always bring them back. The final thing I'm going to make a note of is subdivisions. So we can increase and decrease the number of subdivisions. The more times you subdivide, basically, the more times you subdivide these squares here. So you make different, if we have a look from use that orthodox. We'll zoom out and zoom in. If we increase the subdivisions, we can actually see it fades quite a bit. Now, probably because of the sheer size, it won't do too much at this point. But we can see that it does tend to have an effect, a very small effect on our Blender grids, but not one we should be too concerned about. So the main thing to take away from this lecture is, if you want to get rid of your Blender grid, just untick this box and tick it to bring it back. Thanks guys, and I will see you in the next lecture, where we'll continue on UV editing.